Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, I know we got some big topics to discuss today, but we also have some other stories outside of this Syria news, but that will be the main topic for today. So, without further ado, we will get right into our news about Syria. So, the big news is on Thursday night, news reports came out of U.S. strikes in Syria. Now, when I first heard this, I had a roller coaster of reactions. I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. Who did we strike? Was it the Syrian government proper? Was it Iranian-backed forces, which it was? Was it ISIS? I didn't think it was going to be ISIS or one of those sort of groups because they would have just outright said we bombed ISIS targets because they do make that distinction for you. And then, and this shows like, oh, I'm not surprised. And I didn't really think anything of it. I didn't think it was that massive an escalation. I suspect that, yeah, it was probably pro-Iranian groups. But then I second-guessed myself thinking, why would Biden strike pro-Iranian groups when he's trying to salvage the JCPOA? And I figured he would have wanted to repeat Obama's policy of tough on Syria, conciliatory to Iran. But then I realized it made sense from a negotiation standpoint because in 2015, the Iranian presence in Syria was that of a few advisors and special forces, and not all these different groups. The one that got struck were the PMU. They operate in both Iraq and Syria. They're the Popular Mobilization Unit. They're just they're sort of a big tent organization under the guidance of Iranian forces. So, I mean, of course, especially in Iraq, most of them are Shia Muslims. A significant amount in Syria, of course, are. But I imagine, especially in Syria, they accept Sunnis into the rank. I don't really think they're an explicitly religious or ideological organization. I think they're just really their only idea is we want a closer relationship with Iran, and we're willing to be quite literally their foot soldiers on the ground in foreign countries, particularly Syria and Iraq. But what happened was Biden struck mainly facilities. Now, it did kill fighters, don't get me wrong, but he struck mainly facilities controlled by the PMU, and that had to do a lot with supply routes. Nothing for Hezbollah, nothing for any of these other pro-Iranian groups, just specifically the PMU, because that was the group that allegedly attacked U.S. forces in Iraq the week before, which
Yeah.
that's also the group that allegedly attacked us in last January during the whole dust up with that when Trump almost took us to war with Iran, or allegedly almost took us to war with Iran. But that was the gist of the strikes. But I do want to make the point. I will say this outright. I think in terms of the impact of these strikes, these were worse than Trump's, and we'll get into the differences of the reactions and and just the reactions by liberals in general, and a lot of the people who just realize, wow, this liberal empire thing isn't just a meme or a joke; it's reality. But trust me, we'll get into that. But Trump's strikes, they were very braggadocious. They were very theatrical. Where yeah, especially in 2018 when he was threatening on Twitter, well, Russia said they're going to send their missiles. We'll see how smart their missiles really are. That kind of stuff, and all that rhetoric, all that build up towards it, only for him to. Now, the second strike was much more significant in 2018. They actually did hit targets with bunker busters, that kind of stuff. 2017 was just an empty airfield, but it looks like Biden went for an actual, what could be described as a surgical strike, where he struck key targets that weren't just for flashy for a show, which, again, the liberals loved that he brought seriousness and dignity back to the White House. As that one, who's that one wonderful
Siskin, I
individual?
think
The
yeah.
yeah, the
Wasn't it Siskin who said no middle school tweets with
yes, yes.
insults? Yeah.
That's what I was trying to think of. It was Amy Siskin, who was just your typical blue chart check liberal journo. That's all you need to know. But yeah, no middle school insults, none of that kind of stuff. Return to normalcy. Yes, we have truly returned to normal within the first 30 days of Biden being in office. Or first, yeah, like 37 days, I guess now. Yeah, but
Yeah,
point
I
being,
mean,
within like the
it's
first month
you
of him being in
consider how they
office, we're
make
already striking Syrian targets, and really, I'm not surprised. It doesn't seem like an escalation, and as I saw somebody point out, I wish I could give them credit, but I don't remember. This is the point of using proxy groups in order to avoid escalation. Like, yeah, the U.S. We stifled their operations. We definitely crippled their operations, but we stifled Iranian operations, and Iran was able to weather that strike without taking damage directly to them because they were using proxy groups, thus confirming the purpose of proxy groups.
Right. And I mean, the other half of proxy groups is that, every group that is oppressed by, you know, that triumvirate of America, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, are just Iranian puppets. But, the other half is these people don't like them and they feel oppressed by them. And so, there's a fight that matters to them. Yes, there is a cultural and a religious significance. Yes, Iran, uh, does involve itself with them. The level, I'm not so sure anyone has, the exact figures, but I mean, it's a tit for tat. They're not drones that Iran has turned on. Uh, these people have legitimate grievances. Um, and so, yeah, they're going to look to the only country that's, willing to support them, that have common interests. So,
Yeah, we're in an era of overt pragmatism now. Ideology has always played a role. Pragmatism has always played a role, but ideology plays much less of a role than it does in previous years, as we've discussed, previous centuries, I would say. But yeah, maybe these groups, maybe they don't think Iran is the shining beacon in the region, but they hate them less and are willing to take funds and arms they can get from them to accomplish their goals. Sort of, again, I doubt many people in Washington, D.C. are Sunni Islamists when they want to support groups like Al Qaeda or the FSA or Al Nusra or what's their name? HTS, whatever. Like when they give money to these groups, I doubt Ronald Reagan was thinking Islam will triumph when he funded the Mujahideen in the '80s or whatever. But point being is, like, yeah, there's probably more in common, especially being a regional power for them. But a lot of these groups will take whatever they can get, whatever they can get their hands on. And I mean, trust me, if you were in that situation, you would too. That's the nature of politics, both on a peaceful domestic scale in terms of working with people you don't necessarily like, and in a war zone. It's just the way that works. But you do bring up an interesting point that these people want to throw off the shackles of Iranian oppression, yet are directly cooperating with them. And again, it's this dual narrative they have to pull with the sort of mythology of our empire, because our empire is the great liberator of oppressed people and not an actual empire, despite evidence to the
yeah.
contrary. But again, the entire basis of it is we have to be the beacon of freedom, the shining city on the hill. We have to liberate everyone. So it doesn't work when you have them directly cooperating with the quote unquote oppressive powers. Now, again, of course, there's people who are opposed to Iran on the ground. Like they, after Soleimani's assassination, they showed celebrations in Iraq from, I think it was like Al Anbar, which is like the region Saddam was from, that's full of Sunni Muslims. So, and they tried to say the Iranian people are celebrating the death of this horrible oppressor when it's like,
Yeah, yeah.
of course they're celebrating the death of the guy who helped their tribal enemies. It's like you didn't see these protests in eastern Iraq with the Shia parts. Now again, that just because somebody's a Shia Muslim, that doesn't automatically mean they like Iran, but with the current tension in the region, more or less, again, barring extraordinary circumstances, they're at least willing to tolerate their existence and their presence.
hmm Yeah, and as it turns out, the strike itself, which apparently had killed about 22 people,
But, oh, they were
none
all
of them.
combatants. Don't worry, none of them were civilian casualties. Now, you see, that works is if we just call everyone a combatant, there's no civilian casualties. It's amazing.
Right. So none of these people that were killed were actually Iranians. That doesn't nullify the point that they could be working, uh, you know, for their own interests, but also with Iran. it doesn't nullify that. That's not what I'm saying. But they're not actually, they're not killing actually Iranians. And for a lot of people, they feel like Iran is more of a good than a bad in Syria, because obviously the strike is there as a pinpoint strike to disrupt a flow of arms for where most of the battle is happening and has been happening the last 10 years, which is in Syria, right? So in Syria, there are a handful of Al Qaeda affiliated groups. HTS is the most well known. There is ISIS itself. That's who they're fighting. I mean, I don't hear them fighting directly against the SDF. Uh, it, you know, so yeah, America has a problem if you fight HTS. They have a problem if you're going to fight against ISIS. It doesn't mean America isn't going to kill ISIS itself. America is there to manage ISIS,
Yeah, it's there to
right?
tie up
Like,
loose ends after they've served their purpose.
right, right. So they will go after ISIS when they have to, and usually it's for optics, but they're not going to rid ISIS from Syria. They understand that if the balance of power begins to switch too much towards the Syrian, Russian, Iranian alliance against ISIS, then they will either protect ISIS or leave ISIS alone. ISIS is a wild card. It's meant to continue to destabilize Syria, because ultimately the goal is to divide Syria into separate
Yeah,
countries.
which, as you can see, the Kurdish region in the north. You see, actually, I'm not sure whether to attribute this to great planning or it just kind of worked out for them, but of course, ISIS comes in, they sweep across half of Syria, and cooperation between the Kurds, the Syrian forces proper, Iran, Russia, even outside Western powers, US, France, UK, whatever, they all fight back against ISIS in both Iraq and Syria. You see, that was the wild card, that was the rabid dog they unleashed that did a lot of damage, and that allowed the Kurds to control everything, east of the Euphrates.
Yes, yeah, precisely, precisely. That's the whole point. Um, so, I mean, I think this is interesting. I guess we'll get into Khashoggi later, but I have a kind of a theory about that. One theory is that there was a deal that was struck, probably. Mind you, this is speculation, right? But the theory goes that a deal was struck between Putin and Erdogan, and um, and that involved giving less assistance to the Al Qaeda affiliated groups. Uh, there is another theory that is America would define itself better by aligning more strongly with the Kurds after the failure of the so-called Syrian rebel forces. Remember, they tried for a good 5 years uh, to, to prop them up, and there was already just too much information coming out that they were, aligning with ISIS or Al Qaeda, anyways. Back and forth, and it was around this time that the White Helmets were being discredited. But you also have Trump basically ending funding for these groups. So that lends credence to the second theory that America decided to go with the Kurds, which angered Turkey. And this kind of bolsters the first theory that Russia and Turkey began working more closely together because Turkey doesn't want northern Syria to be a Kurdish bastion next door.
Yes, and again, that gets into the juggling act, and when you bring the American side into it, so it's nothing we have not treaded on before. But to get to some of the reactions to these Syria strikes, of course, we're telling you that the liberals, they loved it. It's America's back. Finally, Biden is out with a more reckless foreign policy, and it's great because he's quiet about it and he's dignified when he orders those strikes. Now, one last thing I will say about the actual strikes themselves is it was almost like an operation Israel would have carried out in the past 3 years, where it was like, again, these precision strikes against these particular groups rather than a grand show. And again, you can, of course, attribute that to change of administration, but I do think it's strange that, of course, I do think he's looking for leverage in the Iran deal, but you could also argue this was a way to reassure Israel after a rocky start to relations with the new administration, as we saw with the with the snubbing of the phone call and the snubbing of meetings. With I mean, the Israeli government outright came and said, "Well, we're not dealing with Obama anymore. The Biden administration is different, so we have some more confidence then." That's what they pretty much said. So
Mm.
I'm wondering, this may have also been like, of course, to gain leverage going into renegotiations of the JCPOA, but I am thinking in large part it probably was an appeasement of Israel, something to gain the trust of Netanyahu by the new administration, taking a new approach than what Obama did, because I mean, Obama's approach was ostensibly a failure from an American perspective.
Right. And also, we should remember that the Russians have set up a base in that corner where you have the line between the border between Syria and Iraq and the south bank or the east west bank of the Euphrates, right in that corner. And this strike was not far from there. So it could be considered a kind of warning. Russians would, of course, know about the transport of arms going through there, anyways. So, I think it was probably, yeah, as I said, a warning to several different parties, as well as an appeasement to Israel. However, Israel is kind of, not that Israel hasn't ever attacked that far off, but Israel tends to focus on Damascus. And part of the reason for that is a demoralization campaign. So they always find some mysterious Iranian backed group in the suburbs of Damascus, always around Christmas. And that's when they bomb. That isn't to say that they don't have more precision targets. They do, but their campaign is far more cynical, and it's there to demoralize the nation.
Yeah, it is about again, it's about dropping something in Assad's, quite literal, his backyard, to the point where,
Yes.
again, like demoralization and also keeping them paranoid, keeping them on their toes, being afraid that, well, I mean, because realistically, Israel, with its military capability, at least in theory, could strike Assad's palace. Now, I imagine the air defenses and the security system is probably a bit more sophisticated than that. But I remember this is a threat they've made before, and funny enough, I think it was either in 2018 or 2019, after a strike on the Damascus airport, the Syrian government threatened that we'll drop a missile right in Netanyahu's palace if you do this again. Some absurd threat like that, and of course there was all this outrage that they would threaten Israel like this, even though they made again Israel's made the exact same threat to Syria. But again, it's different when your friend says it versus when your enemy says that sort of thing. So, I mean, that's all politics really boils down to, isn't it? But back to the
Yeah.
reactions by the by the liberal elite. They, again, as we were talking, they were just in love with this idea that a dignified president who's not afraid to take action, not afraid to stand up to tyrants and bullies, as they would put it. But one more interesting reaction, I would say, is a lot of people who you would say are ostensibly on our side. I'm not calling them dumb. I'm sure many of them are very intelligent people who have an idea of what's going on. But it does seem like they just woke up and saw what was happening in terms of. They would post a lot of the memes, which I admittedly do enjoy, about the bombers plastered with rainbow flags and Democratic slogans, saying, "Well, this is the only difference between a Trump administration and a Biden administration." But it's like we've been talking about liberal imperialism for the past 2.5, 3 years on the show. Global homogeneity, as we'll call it for the our friends over here on YouTube, but. Again, they thought these were all just jokes, all just memes. When, again, not to toot our own horn, but we've been calling this for 2.5, 3 years at this point that, yeah, they will use liberalism as a bludgeon while they drop bombs on third worlders. This is something that um, you should have seen coming if you've been paying any attention to this. Now, admittedly, a lot of people don't keep up with Syria to the extent that people in our circles do, admittedly, so it's a very niche topic, I'll say. But it does just seem like, I suppose I'm not even complaining, but I suppose it's a good thing. It seems like a lot of people really woke up to this. And I do think under Trump it was different because people were expecting Trump to behave like a wild card. They were expecting him to do foolhardy things like this. But when the supposedly serious Biden does it, even people who would have normally been Biden's detractors subconsciously thinking, oh, he'll have a more serious administration, when he just up and bombs Syria, they act more shocked, they act more surprised, which again, like I said, I suppose it's a good thing, is waking people up to the actual issue. But it, it,
Well,
that was one of the most interesting aspects about it, the fact that
Mhm.
a lot of people I thought would have already realized this are just now realizing it.
Right, and that comes down to this kind of dynamic that you still have some Republicans that, are proud when America, engages in some military conflict and they win. And it's ostensibly doesn't even matter against whom. Like they will just support the military in the same way they will just support the police regardless. So I think that is a part of it. However, I think the difference with the Trump administration was during the Obama administration, so much, there was a lot of hay made, but there was also a lot of justifiable reasons to be disgusted with the rise of ISIS. Back in the spring and summer of 2014.
And that's not even
And
counting actual attacks on American targets or by ISIL sympathizers and ISIS members, like the one shooting in California, the attacks on Paris, which I'm pretty sure
yes,
there was a couple Americans killed in that, the downing of airliners, that kind of stuff, like genuinely an international menace beyond the way the neocons use it. Like that's like the one time they were right about something being like an international menace.
right, right. And, of course, we knew that Al Qaeda and Al Qaeda affiliated groups were not just supported in Libya, but they were being supported in Syria. In fact, there's the one infamous email letter where Hillary Clinton admonishes someone and says, in Syria, Al Qaeda are the good guys. So, but there have been ties between, let's say, Middle Eastern Gulf states funding that are on good terms with America that were funding ISIS directly. So I think, ISIS was made to be the menace that it was. And so the idea was that, Trump, the only reason why Trump should even be in the Middle East is to get rid of ISIS, right? And he was very triumphant when he claimed that ISIS was neutralized in Syria, and really at that time, as a force, it was. It resurged in 2020, but it was basically gone in late 2018 and early 2019. So his calls for the reduction or for the removal of U.S. forces, which happened more than once concerning Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, whatever his reasoning for it, that was dangerous rhetoric. That was a no-no, considering that the only time that the press, whether it was the New York Times or CNN or MSNBC, ever called him presidential was his first strike on Syria.
Yeah, and even military force in general wasn't applied equally because his first strike on Syria was very clean cut. He didn't make that much of a deal out of it beyond like saying, "Oh, successful mission, good job to our troops," and we showed Assad who's boss, that sort of thing. The second time with the week-long build-up with different threats and tweets, they were concerned about saying, "Oh, we needed to punish Assad, but he was too reckless about it." And then the assassination of Soleimani was the exact same rhetoric, like, "Oh, he did the right thing on paper, but he was much too dangerous about this and almost got us into a war, and we would have done it right. So realistically, it was only the first Syria strike, which was a very quiet event that most people forgot about, was the only time they praised him and called him presidential.
That's right. That's right. And so I think there was the suspicion, I would say, by the Dems and by certain Republicans that Trump would be too soft in Syria, that he would do many acts which would only be seen as optics. And, him neutralizing ISIS to the degree that he did in eastern Syria was not good, because that gave Assad and Russia and Iran breathing room. Right? I mean, that was the main problem with them. That's what they were angry about. And for him to twice say that we have to reduce troops. Remember the uproar that happened when Trump seceded those two bases, again, in northeastern Syria, to the Russians, right? I mean, people lost their minds. The complaining I heard from the libs at that point was incredible. It was like they stormed the Capitol building.
Oh no.
Oh no. Oh my God. Storming the Capitol building was just like Russians taking over illegal US bases in northern Syria. Anyhow, yeah, but I mean, I saw all these unironic posts on Twitter, mostly replying to Amy Siskind, and it's all these stupid wine moms who are, like, they're going to support Biden. Like, Trump was just this affront to their sensibilities. And really, we should look at Obama as this kind of transitional president, right? Like,
well, maybe you should look at his
Bush
wife
was
for
made
that,
out-
but that's beside the
Yeah.
point.
Bush was made out to be, of course, Hitler. And even though there was a lot of, there was popular support for the war in Iraq, people forget that, 75% of the U.S. public, if you want to believe the stats, believed the war in Iraq was justified. It was just a little bit less than the 83% for the war in Afghanistan. Now, Libya only got about 50%. But again, to come back to my point about how Obama was the transitional president, maybe one way to understand it better is to see how George Bush was portrayed during the Trump presidency, because Bush, who had been made out to be this evil president, this dumb evil president, who was, squandering American lives and wealth and the lives of Middle Easterners and so on and so on. All of that was true. But he was made out to be kind of a good guy. And you saw him palling around with Ellen DeGeneres, right? So Obama was this transitional president. He opened up new wars. He didn't have to bomb Libya, but he did. He didn't have to invade Syria, but he did. He didn't have to sponsor the war in Yemen, but he did. And basically, after 8 years of Bush, you saw the same kind of complacency, maybe even more so from Democrats, that a Democrat president who had replaced an evil warmonger Nazi was ostensibly doing the same thing and much more of it. You can blame Bush for Iraq and Afghanistan, but Yemen, Syria, and Libya are on your watch. That's your responsibility. I mean, I remember the 90s. There were more lefties back then willing to protest against the continuing the war that Bush Sr. had started. So, yeah, Obama was this transitional president where a lot of libs that supported him, particularly, let's say white libs, living in coastal cities, were willing to just completely overlook that. They may even have gone to the anti-war rallies. They were probably in Washington, D.C., just months before the attack. But, they were very quiet when Obama expanded those wars. And so now we're seeing a kind of new fulfillment of that. The left completely accepts wars on their terms, handled their way, indefinitely, right? If I think there's a little bit of pushback. You're seeing it from some of the, YouTube grifters and BreadTube grifters, but you're not really seeing strong opposition in the House to the war. There's been some token stuff from Ilan Omar. I wonder if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but she's arguing from a completely legal point of view. You can do this, but you could have done it legally. Wags finger. So, so I think they've normalized it. They've completely normalized it, and that statistic that we saw back in 2019 about how the wars have better support from Democrat voters than from Republican voters. That's going to be more true going forward, because you see unironic tweets from small accounts that will literally say, non-interventionism is a de facto or crypto fascist position.
Yeah, that's that. I've seen that rhetoric underground, so to speak, for a few years now, but it's becoming more and more normalized, where a lot of regular libs will say, well, if we don't take the fight to the fascists, then we're no better than the fascists, and you might as well be one, sort of claptrap. And of course, Assad's a fascist, Putin is, and everyone who isn't a liberal American or Western European is a fascist. So even communist China is full of fascists. So I guess Nazbol gang out there, your dream has come true. Congratulations. But moving on from that, Khashoggi. That's a name that a lot of you longtime listeners will recognize. How many episodes do we spend on that? Like 6 in a row. This Saudi journalist who was allegedly assassinated by the Saudi government, dismembered even, inside I think it was consulate in somewhere in Turkey. He was executed.
Yeah, I don't know if it was Ankara or Istanbul.
I think it was the consulate in Istanbul where he was allegedly dismembered. Now, of course, he obviously is a dead man right now, but he was this great journalist. And then you go through his records. He actually did coverage in favor of Osama bin Laden's group of the Mujahideen fighting in Afghanistan in the 80s. Did pieces supporting the moderate rebels, quote unquote, in Syria. I'm pretty sure he also justified the war in Yemen. Pretty much a shill for Saudi foreign policy, but got on the wrong side of Prince Mohammed bin Salman personally, and that's why I was taking out. Not because his views were almost completely in line with Saudi and by extension the liberal empire's foreign policy, but I think it was a personal criticism or a personal dispute or whatever that actually got him taken out. But ultimately, this guy was a writer for the Washington Post, so that should tell you all you need to know when it comes to CIA connections, so to speak. But he was liquidated, and it looks like that was one of the things that caused a rift between the U.S. Now, pragmatically, I thought, oh yeah, we can really hammer Saudi Arabia on this. It'll be nice to watch them, suffer the same. Well, it'll be nice to have them be held to the standards we hold countries like Iran, if we're even going to be having these ridiculous standards. It'd be nice to watch the House of Saud suffer. Now, of course, that did not happen. Trump, in a pragmatic way, realized, hey, global energy markets. I already trashed relations with Iran, what little there was there. I don't want gas prices going up anymore, so we're not going to piss off the Saudis. That was his approach. But apparently, it looks like it's back on the table again for the Biden administration to take punitive measures towards Saudi Arabia for this assassination, which, hey, Biden already nuked American domestic energy. Why doesn't he just go for the global market and take on Saudi Arabia? is Biden going to be just as an aside the anti-energy president because he's anti-American energy? He shut down a lot of the fracking operations and axed Keystone. He's against Nord Stream 2 and Russian pipelines in Europe, and he is cracking down. They're considering cracking down on Saudi Arabia for their actions against Khashoggi, which happened like 2.5,
Like
3 years
2 years ago.
ago at this point.
Yeah,
I think it was late 2018 when it happened. So yeah, like two and
it
a half
was
years
like
ago.
August or September,
So
something like.
is Biden like on some weird 4D chess mission to crash the global energy market? I'm honestly thinking that is there some rhyme or reason to the strategy? Does he owe some people some favors? Are they trying to drive energy prices up? Or I don't know. I just have a feeling that all these actions put together, all of them individually can be attributed to mishaps or lack of intelligence, but just these three things within close proximity to each other makes me put on a tinfoil hat now, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I've always thought about, because Khashoggi was sort of famous for a headline like, "Is it time to divide Syria?" Yes, it's time. It was an op-ed that he wrote for the Washington Post, and um, so if you go by the theory that some kind of a deal was struck, maybe between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and it involved Trump as well. Um, getting rid of Khashoggi was like no big deal because I mean, who knows? Again, this is speculation. That's all it is speculation. But you could argue that Khashoggi, beyond the personal insults, could be seen as somebody that wanted uh, more involvement of Saudi Arabia in Syria. And meanwhile, Saudi Arabia and Russia might be working on a deal. Uh, you know, uh, Trump has already killed funding that would probably also include um, Saudi Arabian proxies that were getting funding vis-a-vis the Pentagon, so or the CIA for that matter. But uh, so it's possible, it's possible that they wanted, Khashoggi to shut up because, how big if you and Khashoggi both agree on what should be done to Syria, right? How strong is that personal insult? Like, I mean, it's just a question to ask because you'll remember that very shortly after uh, Khashoggi was dead, and I think the blame wasn't particularly put anywhere. It was basically, well, we're investigating it, and then they put something like over 10 guys in jail because of it. And I kind of and hoped like the matter would go away because, of course, first they denied it, then they said it was an accident, and then they said, well, they didn't mean to kill him, and then they said, yeah, well, they did kill him. But oh yeah, and he was also dismembered. Hopefully he was dead when he was dismembered. But there was that meeting where Putin meets the prince. I don't
Mohammed
know
bin
why.
Salman.
Yeah,
And they do like the handshake thing.
yeah, and like I mean, for a lot of people, that kind of tipped things off. That was an unusually warm greeting. I mean, Putin is a very good statesman. He knows how to be diplomatic and cordial, even warm when he has to be. But this was bro culture. Like it happened so soon after Khashoggi's death and the revelations that followed. It was kind of like, man, did we get him? Like you couldn't help but think that, and that's why I think like, what if there was some kind of a deal? What if Saudi Arabia is getting worried about America's energy exports? Like, it's just something to think about.
Well, I am also saw back in the day, and I'm considering now, that I think Khashoggi was a critic of Mohammed bin Salman because he purged a lot of the old guard, so to speak, in the House of Saud, where he did a lot of reshuffling because he effectively rules the country now. Because it's either his father, I think the current king, I think King Salman is actually his great uncle. I think he, because I know he's the first one not to be a brother to ascend to the throne, not to be a brother of the original king of Saudi Arabia since its establishment after World War II. Yeah, that's how many of them there are. Just keep that in mind. Granted, they have such short, such short reigns because they're all ancient when they come to the throne. He's like in his 30s. I remember the millennial prince is the as the headlines would call him. But I am wondering if it had something to do with that. Maybe he was a loyalist to the old guard, so to speak. So he got that treatment, and also that would fall in line with Saudi Arabia and Russia brokering a deal over Syria, especially if he is a hardliner on Syria. Because again,
Hmm.
it's not like they would want that, but ultimately, I'm just not surprised to see them bring this up again. And I am thinking with my tinfoil hat on, this is part of a larger plot in terms of global energy markets.
Yeah, I did think about that um, back then when it was happening, right? Because I think the way the war was progressing prior to Russia entering the war, I mean, I really do think that you know the West did not want Russia to enter the war. The West wanted Russia to involve itself in a war in Ukraine, and this is another reason why not completely annexing, those parts of Lugansk and Donetsk was important because, as I've mentioned before, if Ukraine is the anti-Russia state, then the Donbass is the anti-Russia, the anti-Russia state, and that has kept Ukraine occupied while it gave Russia a free hand in Syria. So I think if you're looking at late 2015 and probably even well into 2016, the war is going a certain way. It's going a certain way that everybody had wanted it all along. Russia's presence was a concern because it was beginning to tip the balance in a quite rapid way. And it's quite likely that Saudi Arabia saw the writing on the wall, that America was not going to commit more of itself in Syria to counter Russia, and that Russia played its hand very well in Ukraine, and that it was better to work on where you have common interest on energy deals, and rather than fuel a war in Syria that, like, really, it had been going for about 4 years, almost five, when Russia entered the war, and was quickly turning the tide, right? And besides, the West went crazy for it when Russia first began bombing ISIS because Obama hadn't done it at all in Syria. Did it in Iraq, but not Syria. I think everybody saw what was really going on. And you had, like, YouTube channels like Chainsaw, which was part of BuzzFeed or whatever. And, all of them are hurriedly trying to explain, like, why Russia bombing isn't actually a good thing. You knew, like, you saw a lot of the way the power structure works.
Yeah,
You
but on
saw a lot.
contrast, you also, and I suppose this all ties together, saw the rise of groups like South Front, who were present the other narrative on Syria. Now, there was some of that before. There was a lot of skepticism about what they were telling us in the early years of the war, but I think South Front was really revolutionary in terms of it was the first one to tell it from a pretty pro-Assad, pro-Russia point of view.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. Um, yeah, so I guess all I'm saying, just to my bottom line is I think maybe Saudi Arabia saw what was happening, um, and maybe Khashoggi was expendable, even favorable. But I still, I still fail to see how this one journalist could be such a determining factor. There might have been. There's something more to this.
Yeah,
It can't be. I mean, Khashoggi's not big enough um, to piss off or determine a new direction for Saudi Arabia and its relationship to Syria vis-a-vis Russia.
well, that brings me to my next point. The fact that this is getting brought up again makes me think we were discussing, it was either last week or 2 weeks ago, about the contingency plans the U.S. has had since the end of World War II to conduct a massive regime change operation in Saudi Arabia and remove or preserve the House of Saud depending on their needs. Now, I'm thinking we were talking in that in particular how Saudi Arabia is willing to trade oil in the yuan. I imagine other forms of currency will be soon to follow. I mean, that was one of the primary lead ups to the Iraq War. I believe Saddam Hussein was trading his oil in euros, and Gaddafi was in gold. Now, these weren't the sole causes of that. There were other external influences, especially with Iraq. Israel had a very strong security concern that swayed the U.S. to also go in. But point being is the petrodollar, so to speak, is a big factor in a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that Saudi Arabia has been allowed to stand for so long, while sort of moving away from the petrodollar, I wouldn't even say moving away, but broadening its horizons, it does make you wonder about the effectiveness of the U.S. and how volatile the situation is there. Maybe now they're looking to put pressure on Saudi Arabia. Maybe they're fearing that it's not the quote unquote loyal ally, or I suppose we could say useful asset it once was, our second greatest ally, if you will. But
Mm-hmm.
I am wondering if this is sort of the lead up or part of a behind the scenes internal dispute between the US and Saudi Arabia that's happening right now, particularly over deals with China.
Mm-hmm.
Which would be my ultimate guess about the situation. But with that being said, we shall move on to Armenia. Now, this is a story from today that actually caught me a little off guard. Now, I'm going to try to explain this the best I can. So, Armenia is a semi-presidential system, which means they have both a president and a prime minister who hold political power. Now, the prime minister is more the key figure, whereas the president has a veto power, which he used today. Now, I will just get the names here because they are Armenian, and I do have a little bit of difficulty pronouncing Armenian names, and I will just give a brief rundown of it with Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, who's the one blamed for losing the war and not doing enough. He was the Soros-installed puppet. Has urged President Armen Sarkisian to fire Colonel General Onik Gasparian after accusing him of an attempted coup. Now, what had happened was the general, Gasparian, called Pashin's leadership inadequate and disgraceful, in particular reference to the recent war, and said that he should step down. And he is part of the Armenian equivalent of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, one of the highest-ranking generals in the country. So, the Prime Minister moved for his dismissal. The President, who I don't think he's entirely pro-Russian, but I know he has more pro-Russian sympathies than Pashinyan and his Soros-backed ilk, denied this move. And that has caused a rift within Armenian politics, the fact that the President refused to remove a general that outright criticized the Prime Minister. Now, I know, at least in the United States and most of the Western world, generals commenting on politics, barring some events this summer, and of course against the evil dread Trump, is usually a line that is not allowed to be crossed. Now, for a country like Armenia, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, you don't even get this stuff in Russia and China. The military really knows their place in terms of their role in the system. This is like third world banana republic, South America kind of stuff, Africa kind of stuff we're talking about. And it makes sense that something like this would happen in Armenia because of the recent chaos and losing a war. But I do think it's interesting. I do think we're in for a pretty big political dispute if the president doesn't go along with this. That's a overtly politicized moves. In those sort of systems, I'm not saying the president is completely an apolitical figure, but the president is supposed to be more of an apolitical figure in these sort of parliamentary systems where the prime minister takes more of the partisan positions, where he takes the ideological positions, whereas the president is more of just an administrator. Like, really, he's supposed to be a rubber stamp when you request him to dismiss a general like that. And the fact that he didn't, at least my interpretation of the Armenian political system, shows that, I mean, they tried to lynch Pashin, I believe, in November, right after he lost the war.
Mhm.
So again, the man is not popular. He has his core base support. He called his supporters to the streets, trying to, I guess, ape what Yeltsin did in the '90s. So real great role model you got there, truly. But it does look like Armenia is on the path for a pretty major political upheaval sometime in the near future, which I don't think anyone is really surprised about seeing recent events.
Yeah, you know, there was a. I don't know if I mentioned it in one of the shows that we did earlier in January, and Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson had a podcast that he did, and on it was him. He basically said that Pashinyan basically attempted to cripple the Armenian military by getting rid of its top brass. Uh, he's kind of convinced that him being more or less a Soros puppet, that him getting, him paving the way for a victory for Azerbaijan would clear the way in Nagorno-Karabakh for the possibility of a trans-Caspian pipeline. Um, Again, I'm just citing what he said. I don't know how much I believe it myself. I think if you look at the machinations, you can't argue that he was helpful. He wasn't. He did cripple Armenia's ability to fight, and in Nagorno-Karabakh cannot fight without Armenia. So some of these generals were axed like less than a year before this recent war. So it would have been sometime in 2019, 2018, and remember, 2018 there was also a skirmish. So that's one theory that he wanted this to happen because there would be political points, essentially. I don't know what to say. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I thought back then that maybe that there's a lot of truth to this, but it's hard to say.
I would definitely agree, and really, I mean, this is the sort of politics you get with these post-Soviet republics, with these post-Iron Curtain states outside of countries like Russia that have the ability to actually govern themselves. I mean, you think about it, when it comes to nations that are truly sovereign, out of all the former Soviet Union, what can you say? Russia and maybe, I don't know, Kazakhstan? I mean, the rest of them are reliant on either Russia or Western powers to sustain themselves. I mean, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Belarus, the Caucasus, most of Central Asia. Really, I think Russia is the only one that could really sustain itself, so to speak, and has the ability to sustain some of these other smaller Soviet republics, former Soviet republics. But I mean, the kind of the fact that these countries don't know how to govern themselves, or relatively speaking, doesn't really surprise anyone. Really, doesn't really surprise me. And again, I do think, like I said when they made the peace deal, this is just kicking the can down the road. This issue will be addressed again, by hardliners on either side. And I do think the Armenians are fed up. I think they're frustrated. I don't think they really bought into the. I think particularly the discontent with Pashin means they don't really bought into the Western claims about Russia betraying them or whatever. But I could be wrong, but I do think, for better or for worse, Armenia is going to have some sort of nationalistic fervor about this and try to charge into this head on. And again, best of luck to them. I do want them to reclaim their territories, but I think they're walking into a meat grinder, and I do think we're seeing the beginning stages of that.
Yeah. The blame has already started with some Armenian sources claiming that the Russian Iskandar missiles were ineffective, and Russia showing videos where the Iskandar missiles were effective, showing video footage of this, and then making the counter argument that coordination on the part of our media was lacking. And I think also when you listen to that podcast with Johnson, like that is the case. It was extremely poorly planned. There was a lack of coordination. They were sent into, I mean, both sides sent men into meat grinders. You'll remember that the Syrian rebels that were shipped there, they too became meat grinder materials. So, but Armenia cannot afford to lose men the way Turkey can. And in that, me just saying Turkey, you kind of get a sense of who was assisting. Azerbaijan was the favored country here. Whether Pashinyan meant it or not, he did cripple his own military prior to this skirmish, and something that was not a very prudent thing to do, considering that they had a flash in 2018 that could have devolved had Armenian forces not prevailed into what we saw last autumn, or last summer rather. Well, it was in that transition period, but it remains to be seen like what they're going to do next. Now, Turkey has like a more direct path to Azerbaijan. We'll see if infrastructure starts to be negotiated there in the next couple of years. That'll be something interesting to watch. I don't know how they're going to pull it off, and this is why, like, maybe I'm not so sure about the Pashinyan story, that he wanted to lose, or he wanted to lose particularly because of a possibility of constructing a pipeline, because South Stream, just South Stream, or Turk's Stream, is complete. It's done. It's functional. In a way that negates Azerbaijan. Not that Turkey wouldn't mind becoming a hub for even more gas and oil to be funneled into Europe. I don't think it would mind it at all. It just doesn't make it doesn't make it as urgent.
Yeah, I would say so too. And really, like I said, all we can do is keep an eye on this conflict. But I think we're seeing the beginnings of something new, as we said we would. But moving on from that, we have a couple more subjects. So Angela Merkel, the lame duck Chancellor of Germany, said she will not be taking the Pfizer vaccine. Now, she didn't express any particular comments, but what we were left to assume was that it has a lower effectiveness rate. Now, we saw Macron take the same path. He didn't say he personally wouldn't take it, but he said France wouldn't be using it, and I think he also came out against the AstraZeneca vaccine, which again requires the extremely cold temperatures to remain stable. So we're seeing a even more gradual shift away especially with the news about China becoming Germany's largest trading partner, surpassing France, which, as you were pointing out to me, defeats the purpose of the European Union in terms of keeping France and Germany in economic interdependence. As the theory behind the European Union is we need cordial relations between the French and the Germans because one of the greatest enemies of liberalism is having France and Germany constantly at war. Which, I mean, they're not entirely wrong, but again, their agenda was plain
Yeah.
as day. They outright said it, and
Yeah, this is before Britain was brought in. And so the idea was Germany would be the manufacturing hub and France would be the leading consumer hub. It wouldn't be a direct, you know, contrast or 1 to 2 kind of or 0 to 1 binary relationship. Of course, France would have its own manufacturing infrastructure, but by and large, France would be the consumer capital and Germany would be the manufacturing capital.
yeah, and of course that sprung out in terms of Europe, and then yeah, countries joined in on those two things, and again, Germany being the main producer, exporting all these goods across Europe, and then relations with Eastern Europe opened up after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and that became the pool of cheap labor, whether that be construction, manufacturing, whatever. I don't know, even selling cigarettes, as I know your people love to do. But again, you saw this outgrowth, and it looked like things were functioning there for a while. Then, of course, we saw the skepticism of the European Union. But as you were saying in a tongue-in-cheek manner, but I do take seriously, and I do think you meant semi-seriously, that we will see something of a Eurasian bloc form coherently by 2040, and we're already seeing the groundwork for that. Macron and Merkel and France and Germany in general. Again, let me find the map. Let me find the map. The Biden map. Yeah, right there. The only map right now. In a scenario where Trump is not president, France and Germany are both expected, right there in pink, to seek relations with other powers, whether that be within the European Union, with China, whatever. So we have that. We have that right there. Now, again, we've been harping on this for I don't know, when did we bring up these maps? I think we brought them up like in September at this point. So I think I've been doing this bit for almost 6 months now. But point being is we are seeing this. We're seeing a lack of confidence in the U.S. Nord Stream. All of this. It looks like we are. I don't know. Maybe we're getting. I think it was De Gaulle's dream of that axis that connects Paris, Berlin, and Moscow, all in one harmonious unit. And then they're going to attack on China, which you know after watching the failures of the Anglosphere and the liberal world order, and again, have a positive opinion of China, have a negative opinion of China. I think there's cases for both in terms of how much of a threat is China actually, whatever. But point being is, from a German perspective, from a French perspective, from a European perspective in general, there is no reason not to trade with this behemoth that, again, has been trying to become a mercantile empire for, as again, you were saying, a massive Venice for its entire lifespan. And it looks like it might
Mhm.
finally accomplish that. And that's because of really, I mean, I'm not saying the Chinese regime has not worked hard to put it where it is today, but this is possible because of the unprecedented rate of decline, the unexpected rate of decline of the West, of the Anglosphere. Everyone knew things were starting to come to a close. Everyone knew the sun was setting. But I think 2020 really solidified that in terms of the trajectory the West is really on and how rapid it would be. And China, again, ironically enough, even though they were ground zero of the virus, which sort of caused all of this, was the real center point of all the chaos last year and arguably this year, made out the best somehow. But I'm just looking at
Yeah.
all that, getting back to my original point. It's completely rational for the Germans who have pretty much gotten all they can out of America. I mean, they've been an occupied country for 80, 75, 80 years at this point. They've been reunified for 30 years. It really makes sense why they would turn their direction eastward. And I'm trying to remember who said it. I think it was somebody on Twitter. By the way, as we're recording this, massive Twitter purges are underway. So If you see this in the next few hours, just check your account. Just stay safe and just don't do anything stupid online. That's what I would tell you. Now, I can't control you, but I'm just washing my hands of the situation, abdicating myself of all responsibility. So, with that being said, Germany will always do what is most efficient. For years, it was cooperation with the U.S. trying to reunify, and that didn't bar cooperation with the Soviet Union, especially in Eastern Germany. Even West Germany had, they didn't have poor relationships with the Soviet Union, but as China rises, as Russia begins to rebuild itself to some form it used to be, they're going to turn eastward, and that's really no surprise. And yeah, a lot of the Anglosphere concerns, in theory, are justified, but that is assuming the Anglosphere, the West at large, is a civilization that takes itself seriously. Because if we took things seriously, we would have never been in this position in the first place. We would have never had this incestuous relationship with China that we have. But lo and behold, here we are. And that begs the question, when you see China as an actual civilizational threat, which, like I said, in theory it is, I think you actually have to have a civilization to preserve to confront a civilizational threat. But that's my humble opinion.
Right. And, we shouldn't forget that um, Russia was the biggest buyer in Europe of German products, including luxury products, of any European nation. Right. So, it's very tantalizing for Germany going forward to begin, let's say, forging a more independent path. Now, I'm still beside myself, to be perfectly honest. I didn't know what to say about Nord Stream 2, but I almost didn't expect it to be allowed, quite honestly. There was a part of me that didn't believe it would happen. Now, I understand it. There was also a part that thought it would. I could not picture the scenario or the costs of that, and I still can't. Considering that Germany is under such scrutiny by the U.S., historically speaking, and that Biden shut down the Keystone pipeline. I thought, if he's shutting down the Keystone pipeline, then surely that would be terrible if Nord Stream 2 goes ahead, because you've kind of got nothing. At least keep the Keystone for a more autarkic economy where, if it's still too expensive for the Europeans, and this is why, they're going with the Russians. Because let's face it, nobody in Europe complained during the Soviet Union to Russia for its ability to deliver, to deliver the energy needs to fulfill energy needs of Western Europe. Now, Reagan did complain, of course. He wanted it shut down. But it was only after the fall of the Soviet Union that there were problems with Ukraine.
Yeah, the entire Cold War was prefaced on the West sending the Soviet Union food and the Soviet Union selling oil to the West. It was, it's definitely not comparable to the situation we're in with China today, because trade is so deep with China. But to act like, barring certain points, maybe like the Cuban Missile Crisis or Reagan's first few years, that there wasn't some degree of normal relations between the West and the East during the Cold War is sort of post-Cold War mythology.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so, yeah. Anyhow, it just surprises me. It's so, frankly, unexpected. But yeah, here we are. Maybe, in a year we're going to have a better picture and a better understanding of how could this be happening. Because in a way, for me, it's kind of a sign of American decline, but it's happening more rapidly than I would have thought. 2014 was not so long ago that, the European Union went along with, America's bidding to slap on the first set of sanctions, and then after the downing of that plane, the second set of sanctions, and then just on and on, right? There's always a reason to slap on sanctions, which I'm sure will continue to happen. There will always be a reason to sanction Russia. But the first few sanctions, the first two salvos, if you will, those really did hurt the economy of the EU, of certain EU nations that depended on, everything from Poland selling its apples to France selling its cheese to Germany selling its vacuum cleaners and cars, what have you. There was a cost for all those nations, but they played along. And then, just to see 7 years later, things going in such a wildly different direction, I don't know, I'm a bit beside myself. It just, in terms of geopolitics, that's really rapid.
Well, I suppose that just shows how fragile the system was. I mean, something about building houses on sand. I think you guys know what we're getting at. But point being is, just to zoom out to give a look over the past few centuries, the imperial powers of Western Europe, it did actually look like, despite some of the drawbacks of having an empire, and especially towards the end with taking colonies for the sake of colonies, not really any material or strategic benefit to owning some patch of land in Africa or Asia. The British, the French, the Spanish, etc., they actually had long-term goals. They had an idea of what their empire is for and how to actually improve their standing in the world for their people. The American Empire, post-Cold War American Empire, I'll say, was a bribery racket to put a meat shield between us and the Soviet Union, particularly in Europe. That's what the Marshall Plan was about. That's what the free trade regime was about. That's what American control of the seas was about. It was not about increasing the wealth of Americans at home, the prosperity of Americans at home, and putting us in a better position as maybe some of the more earlier imperial projects of Western Europeans may have. It was about, again, fighting somewhat of an ideological war. I'm not going to say it's entirely about ideology, but it was about putting that meat shield between us and the Soviet Union because we didn't want to confront them ourselves, and it was a very, I don't even want to call it selfless, because that would imply there was some degree of benevolence to it, and it wasn't just some sort of policy to shirk responsibility, but it was almost, again, I think outsourcing is the best word, outsourcing of these sort of things in order to keep them on our side, when realistically, like, again, it is like no empire the world has ever seen because of that, because historically empires, even the early American Empire, think somebody like Theodore Roosevelt, Spanish-American War, whatever, actually at least tried to put on the image that it served the goals of the people, and at many times genuinely did try to serve the interests of the people. But we're in an era where, again, it is this ideological empire, it is this selfless empire, and it's really, I suppose you could call it a reverse empire, with sending the wealth overseas rather than bringing wealth from overseas.
Right, and it really ran counter. I mean, World War II shifted American policy to such a great extent. America's more traditional isolationism, its protectionism with its products, its refusal to get entangled in Western affairs back when Europe was arguably globalism, and the Monroe Doctrine, so on and so forth. I mean, even the Prussians adopted America's sort of economic nationalism, of creating an Antarctic economy, being highly protective when it came to trade, not to get unfairly, dominated over a protracted period of time. And, now what you have, America does subsidize a lot of Europe, including Germany. We often talk about China when we're talking about running a trade deficit. Trump wasn't wrong on that. Like, you can hate Trump. Like, you can even argue how sincere he was about that.
Yeah, but these are points
Um,
people like Obama made.
right. Yes. Yes. And let's not forget that even Obama's TPP was already a step toward breaking ties with China. So it's not like, oh, it's just um, a feverish nightmare of Orange Man, and it's just fear mongering. No, 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 no. It's much more nuanced than that. Um, so yeah, so what we have now is this financial empire. Um, I mean, we talk about how China can't really ever become an autarkic economy, and how a lot of it is finance, but a lot of it is also manufacturing. And yeah, you can make a faster profit by doing finance over manufacturing, and that's the allure. That's what caused the the shipment of America's industry overseas. Um, but when it comes to, like, let's say it's a hot war, well, where's your manufacturing taking place? Are you on good terms with that country? When it comes to COVID, well, your pharmaceuticals, your protective gear, who's making that? And we saw the problems that arose because of that. So it sets up this dynamic where you have to have this military that enforces your rule, right, to keep your financial empire, because you're weak on the manufacturing level and you are refusing to develop your autarkic abilities. So that's the long and the short of it.
And I think you put it better than I could have. And I'll leave you with just just a side story, something that is sort of amusing and sort of also shows where things stand. So our final story is the delegation that Biden sent to China. They had to take a COVID test, but this wasn't any ordinary COVID test. Let's just say it was a rectal COVID test. They did that, and when they were met with a degree of backlash, they immediately recanted and apologized and said, "Oh, it was just a big mistake because something so intimate, something so personal, that sort of action is clearly just a mistake, a misunderstanding. Trust me, buddy. You don't get it. It's all fine. We didn't mean to." And it does make me wonder: is this the new politics here? Is this the new form of geopolitics where you force your adversaries' delegations to undergo humiliating rituals before you meet with them, but if you get called out, you apologize and call it a mistake? Will we do the same thing to Russian or Chinese diplomats? Maybe not that exact thing, but some ridiculous, degrading thing in the name of safety or public health or whatever in order to do it. I think that might just be the new catty, petty sort of way global superpowers will now attack each other. Is harass, not even directly harass their diplomats, but harass them in ways that are plausibly deniable, which I imagine has probably been going on for years, but this is an explicit example of it, and it's just funny with particularly Biden's ties to the Chinese establishment and how pivotal role he played in integrating America and China into this incestuous relationship, that his delegation were given such a procedure, so to speak. It's very symbolic.
Well, you kind of have to think, did everybody really complain that much about it, given whose administration it is? And
Yeah. I mean,
no, no, no. I don't want to make light of it. But on the other hand, the Chinese are probably thinking, your embassies always have these two flags, and we really didn't think you'd mind, bigots.
yeah, we were just trying to respect your culture. We saw the last guy Trump had in here, Richard Grenell. I thought that was just a standard American practice. I mean, and at that point,
Yeah.
again, I know you made this joke already, but honestly, with the people who staff the State Department, truly a significant amount of them probably did not mind. Let's just say that. But but it really does show where things are right now, and again, this is supposedly the country that rules the world. This is the return to normal, as I like to say, because you know what, Biden, he's gonna build back better. He's gonna return to normal, and it's gonna be great, guys. It's gonna be fine. And with that, we will leave you with another episode of the War Report. Again, stay safe from whatever weather events. I know last week was rough. I know the last couple weeks were rough in terms of the snowstorms and everything. From any
And
chaos, any upheaval, any of that sort of stuff. And if you're on if
major
you're on
bird
social
down.
media or Twitter, try not to get banned because they are going hard. I've been a good boy. I've been keeping this show clean. All that kind of stuff. So hopefully we will see you guys on YouTube again. If not, I will have alternatives set up. I still need to get to that, but I will try to set something up. So I'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Take care.